June 12, 1993, a quiet Saturday in Forest Ridge, Oregon. A mother of two drives to the local Evermart to buy groceries and a small box of birthday candles for her son's 7th birthday. Security footage captures her entering the store in daylight, smiling, carrying a reusable bag. And then she's gone. No exit, no witness, no sign of struggle. For years, investigators searched every road, every field, every name. Yet the question endured. How can a woman vanish inside a crowded supermarket in the middle of an ordinary afternoon? The kind of place where people still waved from their driveways and news traveled slower than the wind. In the Crawford home on Maple Grove Street, the day rose with the smell of toast and the low hum of a radio left on from the night before. Elena Crawford moved through the kitchen with a practiced calm, her sleeves rolled neatly, a pencil tucked into her bun. She worked part-time as the town high school librarian, a job that had given her a precision for order. Labels straight, books squared, numbers written in blue ink only. Her husband, Thomas, had already left for a weekend electrical job outside Portland, his toolbox clanging once as he closed the truck door. He'd kissed her cheek without coffee, murmured he'd be back late. She hadn't asked how late. After 13 years of marriage, silence was their shorthand. On the table sat the same small spiral notebook Elena used every weekend. House ledger, she called it. She checked the pantry, marked what was missing, then added an extra line at the bottom in smaller handwriting. Birthday candles. It was for Sam, her 6-year-old, whose birthday fell the next day. She had promised to bake a simple vanilla cake, the kind he liked, with red frosting. By 1:30, the house had settled into its soft afternoon stillness. Megan, 9, was upstairs rereading a worn library copy of Charlotte's Web. Sam was building something indefinable out of broken radio parts. Elena tidied the sink, folded the grocery bags, and took her keys. Before stepping out, she paused by the living room shelf where a family photograph stood. Taken last Christmas, everyone wearing paper crowns. She straightened the frame, smiled faintly, and left. The June air was warm, smelling faintly of asphalt and rain held back. She drove her light blue Chevrolet Caprice along the main road toward town, the same route she took twice a week for errands. Witnesses would later recall seeing her at the intersection near the old mill, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel to a song no one could identify. It was 1:34 p.m. Evermart appeared at the bend of Redwood Avenue, a squat one-story building with faded red signage and a half-working neon clock that blinked 2 minutes slow. The parking lot was half full. Families, retirees, a cluster of bicycles leaning on a lamppost. Elena parked 3 rows from the entrance, locked the car, adjusted her canvas tote on her shoulder, and walked toward the sliding doors. A security camera mounted above the frame caught her at 1:42 p.m., her head slightly bowed, eyes scanning the list she'd written. It was the only clear image ever recorded of her after leaving home. Inside, the store's air was cool and smelled of oranges from the produce aisle. The clerk remembered her because she greeted him by name, as she always did. Elena had been a regular, organized, polite, never in a rush. She picked up flour, milk, chicken, a small box of decorations, and paused at the bakery to ask if the chocolate frosting could be ordered with extra sprinkles. She smiled when the baker said yes. At the checkout, she paid with cash, folded the receipt carefully into her wallet, and pushed her cart toward the exit. What happened in the next minutes remains uncertain. Outside, she loaded the bags into the trunk, rearranged them twice as if calculating space. It was an ordinary motion caught by a single exterior camera, the last verifiable act of her life. Something made her stop mid-movement, tilt her head, and pat her coat pocket. The wallet was there, but she hesitated, Then, in that brief stillness, she appeared to remember something. Perhaps it was the missing item, the small detail on her list written in a different ink. She closed the trunk, left it unlocked, and turned back toward the entrance, empty-handed. At 1:48 p.m., she re-entered Evermart. The camera above the door flickered, capturing a blurred figure in white and denim. The timestamp on the tape would later read 1:48, though the clock was 2 minutes slow. She moved past the registers toward the service counter, possibly to ask about the birthday candles she'd forgotten. Beyond that counter was a narrow hallway leading to the restrooms and employee offices. From there, the view of the cameras ended. By 2:15, customers came and went. The clerks rotated shifts. A delivery truck idled behind the store. But no one noticed Elena again. Her car remained in the same spot all afternoon, the driver's window reflecting the sunlight until evening cooled the glass. When her husband returned home hours later, the groceries still sat in that trunk. Milk spoiled, ice cream melted, a bag of flour burst open across the seat like a pale dusting of snow. The record would later call it the disappearance interval, a span of minutes without witness or sound, the kind of gap investigators dread because it leaves nothing to touch, nothing to measure. It began at 1:48 p.m., when a woman walked back through automatic doors to buy candles for her son's birthday, and it ended, if one can call it an end, 11 years later, when a demolition crew's hammer met an unexpected hollow space behind a wall. But that June afternoon, no one knew anything yet. The town carried on with its weekend rhythm. And somewhere, inside a building full of light and voices, Elena Crawford simply stopped being seen. When dusk fell over Forest Ridge, the quietness that usually felt familiar took on a different weight. By 6 in the evening, the Crawford house should have been filled with the sounds of dinner, the radio humming, plates clinking, Sam's running feet. But instead, the air was still. Megan sat by the front window with her library book unopened, watching for the blue Chevrolet that never appeared. She called out once, then twice. No answer. At 6:10, she dialed her father's pager number. When there was no response, she called her aunt, Nancy, who lived 2 streets away. "She's not home yet," Megan said, her voice small and rehearsed. "She went for groceries at lunchtime." Nancy arrived by 6:30. Together they checked the kitchen. No groceries, no note, coffee cup still on the counter, lipstick stain on the rim. It looked as though Elena had stepped out and planned to return within the hour. Nothing felt disturbed, yet something was wrong in the air, the way time begins to stretch when someone should have been home by now. Nancy decided to drive toward the Evermart herself, taking Megan along. At the store, the parking lot buzzed under orange sodium lights. Shoppers were leaving with carts, laughing, calling to one another. Everything looked painfully normal. But there, in the 3rd row from the entrance, sat the blue Chevrolet Caprice, parked straight, windows rolled up, the driver's seat empty. Nancy stopped the car. "Stay here," she told Megan, and stepped out. Through the glass, she saw grocery bags inside, chicken, milk, and a carton of ice cream sagging into liquid. The air inside was misted white from condensation. She opened the door, half expecting her sister's purse or sweater, but there was only the faint smell of something sour and the low tick of the cooling engine. By 7:15, Thomas Crawford had arrived home to an empty house and a blinking light on the answering machine. "Call me right now," Nancy's voice said, clipped with fear. He grabbed his keys and was gone again within a minute, driving faster than he ever had on that 2-lane road. When he reached Evermart, 2 police cruisers were already parked near the entrance. A young patrolman, barely 30, was taking notes. Thomas pointed at the car. "That's my wife's." His voice cracked on the last word. Officer Greg Tolan noted the time, 7:42 p.m., and began standard procedure. The vehicle was unlocked, no sign of forced entry. The engine was cold, keys missing, the front seat neatly arranged. In the cup holder, a pair of sunglasses. On the passenger seat, a paperback novel, The Secret Garden, likely borrowed from the school library. It still smelled faintly of chalk dust and the sweetness of paper long handled by children. Tolan wrote in his report, "Interior appears undisturbed. No immediate evidence of struggle." At 9:05, Detective Laura King was called from the county office. She arrived wearing a gray windbreaker with her badge clipped to the pocket, her hair pulled back. Laura was known for being methodical, not easily impressed by panic. The scene that greeted her, a neat car, groceries melting quietly, told her one thing. This wasn't someone who chose to disappear. She requested the store manager immediately. The man who came forward was Frank Delaney, 47, round-shouldered, a permanent ring of sweat on his collar. He had worked at Evermart for over a decade and knew every creaking tile in the floor. "We close at 9, ma'am," he said quickly, "but I'll help any way you need." His eyes shifted often, not yet suspiciously, but as if waiting for instructions. Laura asked to see the surveillance tapes. In 1993, the security system used slow-loop VHS tapes that recorded in 6-hour intervals. The playback was grainy, but visible enough. On the monitor, Elena appeared at 1:42 p.m., a small figure walking through automatic doors. She spent several minutes in view of the camera near the registers, smiling at a clerk, then disappeared toward the produce section. She reappeared again, pushing a cart full of groceries. At 1:59, she paid, folded the receipt neatly, and walked out. Laura rewound the tape, her eyes narrowing. "You said your cameras cover every exit?" she asked. "All except the service corridor," Delaney answered. "That's behind the counter, restricted area." He gestured vaguely toward a narrow hallway. "Just storage and restrooms. No cameras there, ma'am." The detective pressed the pause button. Elena's figure was frozen mid-step, half-turned as if remembering something. The timestamp read 1:59:34. "Could she have come back in?" Laura asked. Delaney hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I think she did. I remember seeing someone come back a few minutes later, maybe her. I can check." He scrolled the tape forward. At 1:48 on the clock, actually 1:50 by his own admission, the same woman entered again, head slightly bowed. The camera caught her for only 2 seconds before she moved beyond its range. After that, nothing. "Does that hallway lead anywhere else?" Laura asked. "To the restrooms, office, and old maintenance access," Delaney said. "But that's sealed. Has been since before I started here." Laura jotted the details carefully. "I'll need to see it." They walked together past the empty registers, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. At the end of the hall, Laura found a small corridor with 2 doors, one labeled Employees Only, another unmarked. She tried the unmarked door. It was locked. "Where does this go?" she asked. "Just a wall now," Delaney said quickly. "Used to be maintenance, but we closed it off years ago." The air smelled faintly of cleaning fluid and something else. Older. Concrete dust, perhaps. Laura leaned closer, noting how the baseboard ended unevenly, as if once connected to something larger. She returned to the parking lot by midnight. The forensics van had arrived, the perimeter taped off. A K9 unit began its sweep. The dogs sniffed around the car, circled twice, then led their handlers to the store entrance. Inside, they followed the same path seen on the video, through the main aisle, past the registers, down the narrow hallway, and then stopped, whining softly at the wall behind the service desk. The handler looked puzzled. "They lose the scent here," he said. "Completely gone." Laura knelt, pressing her palm against the cool paint. Solid. No draft, no seam, just silence. She wrote in her notebook. Scent terminates at interior wall behind counter. Possible concealed space. By 2 a.m, the store was empty except for officers and the hum of the refrigerators. Thomas stood near the exit doors, pale, refusing to sit. When Laura approached, he asked only one question. Does that mean she was here? She didn't answer directly. It means she came inside, she said. We'll find out what happened after that. The preliminary report listed no evidence of theft, no ransom, no sign of violence. Elena's purse and keys were missing, her bank cards unused. The police classified it as a missing adult, suspicious circumstances. Before dawn, the car was towed for examination, the store sealed pending investigation. Outside, the early light was a washed gray. Thomas leaned on the hood of his truck, staring at the now quiet building. The grocery bags from the trunk had been placed beside him, tagged for evidence. Milk curdled, bread collapsed, a faint outline where the ice cream had melted and refrozen under the night air. Detective King watched from a distance, her breath visible in the cold. Somewhere behind those bright windows and glossy linoleum floors, something had gone terribly wrong. And though she could not yet prove it, Laura King wrote a final line in her log before leaving the scene. Last confirmed location. Interior of Evermart, 1:48 p.m. Status: unresolved. That night marked the beginning of what locals would later call the silence behind the wall. By the following week, the Crawford case had become front-page news in Oregon's small but tightly connected media circuit. Local stations ran the same still frame over and over again. Elena stepping through Evermart's glass doors, her outline soft from the tape's poor resolution. Reporters called her the librarian who vanished in daylight. Volunteers combed the nearby woods, drainage ditches, and the railroad tracks that curved behind the shopping complex. Every search ended the same way. Boot prints fading into mud, flashlights dimming, silence swelling where answers should have been. Detective Laura King expanded her perimeter twice. She ordered interviews with all 17 employees who had worked the day of June 12th. Their accounts overlapped uneasily. Some remembered seeing Elena chatting near the registers. Others swore she'd already left the store by 2 o'clock. None had seen her re-enter. Frank Delaney, the manager on duty, insisted the security footage covered every possible exit. If she walked out, the camera would have caught her, he said. When Laura asked why the rear corridor wasn't monitored, he blamed budget constraints. She made a note. No secondary camera coverage. Service hallway unverified. 3 days later, Evermart reopened under police supervision. Officers dusted the back corridor for prints. Only staff fingerprints appeared, all belonging to employees with long tenures. Behind the counter, Laura found a faint irregularity in the wall paint, a section slightly newer in shade than the rest. She tapped it with her knuckles. Solid. No hollow echo. She asked Delaney who repainted that area. Maintenance did, he said, years ago. She requested the maintenance records. None existed before 1995. On June 20th, a construction worker named Ronald Pierce became the first suspect. He had recently repaired wiring in the town library where Elena worked, and he matched a man seen near Evermart that afternoon. He was brought in, sweating and defensive, claiming he'd been buying supplies at a hardware store. When pressed, he produced a receipt, June 12th, 2:05 p.m., from a shop 15 miles away. The timestamp cleared him. Still, the press seized on his name. For several weeks, he was photographed leaving the police station, face covered, while headlines speculated about a handyman's dark secret. As July turned into August, the case cooled. Leads withered quickly. The dog team brought in from Portland failed to trace any scent beyond the first 20 feet inside Evermart. Waterways were dredged, abandoned wells searched. No clothing, no purse, no keys. Laura King's report described it plainly. Subject disappeared within enclosed structure. No evidence of egress. Current hypothesis: abduction by unknown party utilizing restricted access or concealed exit. But there was no such exit, and no witnesses to anyone forcing her out. The contradiction gnawed at her. A disappearance without motion. At home, Thomas Crawford tried to maintain normal rhythms. He kept Elena's coffee mug on the same kitchen shelf, washed and turned upside down. Megan returned to school in September, quieter than before, drawing pictures of candles and cakes she refused to explain. Sam, barely 7, asked each night if his mother might call once the police found her map. The family avoided the Evermart entirely. For months, Thomas drove an extra 2 miles to another store just to buy bread. Every trip past the old lot made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. By winter, the local newspaper had moved on. The Crawfords' photograph, a smiling family beneath a Christmas wreath, faded on the bulletin board at the post office. But Detective King refused to close the file. She drove back to Evermart several times alone, sitting in her car long after midnight. The building stayed lit all night for restocking, its windows reflecting the red of passing cars. She couldn't shake the sense that something inside those walls didn't fit the blueprint she'd been shown. In April of 1994, the state police formally reclassified the case as inactive, cold file. The box containing Elena's evidence, 1 VHS tape, a stack of photographs, her grocery list, and the melted contents from the trunk, was sealed and shelved in the basement archives of the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. The label read, Crawford, Elena M. Missing person, 06-1293, Forest Ridge. It gathered dust beside 30 other unsolved cases. Life in the small town adjusted to her absence. Evermart stayed open, repainting its aisles and changing staff. The service corridor remained, sealed behind a locked door no one bothered to question. Thomas sold his blue Chevrolet, unable to stand the sight of it. Megan entered high school, thoughtful and withdrawn. Sam began to fix old radios and lamps, perhaps searching subconsciously for the sound that had gone missing from their home. Detective King transferred to the County Major Crimes Unit in late 1995, bringing copies of the Crawford file in her briefcase. Some cases never end, she told a colleague when asked why she kept it. They just wait for someone to look again. In 1997, Evermart replaced its old flooring, layering tile over tile. That same year, the store changed ownership, the new management unaware of the anomaly buried within its own walls. Through the late 90s, occasional tips surfaced. A woman seen at a gas station in Spokane, another matching her description volunteering at a shelter near Eugene. But every lead collapsed under scrutiny. The tone of the investigation shifted from urgency to resignation. Families learn to live with questions when there are no answers left to chase. By 2003, 10 years had passed. The Crawford children were grown. The detective had silver strands in her hair. Evermart, once the town's busiest store, stood half empty, scheduled for demolition the next spring. And somewhere deep within its bones, behind concrete, plaster, and forgotten paint, the truth waited, still intact, untouched, perfectly preserved in silence. The winter of 2003 pressed against Forest Ridge like a held breath. The Evermart building stood at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering red over an empty parking lot where weeds broke through the asphalt. Most locals no longer shopped there. A larger supermarket had opened on the highway, stealing the customers and leaving the old place half dark. A paper notice taped to the sliding doors announced, "Property sold, scheduled demolition." March 2004. For a town that measured life by its routines, the closure felt like erasing a landmark. Detective Laura King saw the headline in a small column of the Portland Tribune while drinking her morning coffee. Old Evermart sold to developers. The article was barely 2 paragraphs, but it stopped her cold. She hadn't thought of the Crawford case in months, yet the name pulled her back instantly. That building had been the last confirmed place Elena was alive. The thought of it being reduced to rubble without anyone ever learning what happened made her uneasy. She phoned the demolition company listed in the notice, introduced herself, and asked to be informed when the work began. The man on the other end, polite but confused, agreed. 3 months later, in mid-November 2004, she received the call. Demolition was starting that week. The project manager was Miguel Santos, a veteran contractor with 20 years of experience dismantling commercial structures. Laura drove the 2 hours to Forest Ridge in light rain, parking near the rusted sign that still read, Evermart, friendly prices. The store looked smaller than she remembered, its windows dusty, the inside gutted of shelves. Miguel met her by the loading dock. "We're just taking down interior walls today," he said, offering a helmet and gloves. "You want to look around before we start?" Inside, the air was stale, heavy with plaster and old detergent. Fluorescent bulbs hung loose from their fixtures. The tile floors were streaked with gray dust. Laura walked the aisles slowly, each step echoing. She could almost see the ghost of a woman with a canvas tote walking these same paths 11 years earlier, stopping at the bakery, smiling at a cashier. Near the back, she found the hallway she remembered, the one behind the service counter. The same unmarked door stood there, paint yellowed, handle rusted. She touched it lightly. "This part stays until tomorrow," Miguel said. "We'll break through then." The next day, November 18th, at around 10 in the morning, the work began. Miguel's team of 4 started with sledgehammers, hitting each section of the wall in steady rhythm. Dust rose like smoke. On the 3rd swing, Miguel paused. "Feels hollow," he said. He hit again. The sound changed, a deeper echo. He motioned for the others to stop. "This ain't solid concrete," he muttered, wiping his face. He struck once more and a crack spread outward like a spider web. As a chunk fell away, a smell drifted out. Dry, metallic, and wrong. Miguel crouched, shining his flashlight through the hole. At first he saw what looked like pipes, then something pale amid the debris. He leaned closer, eyes adjusting to the darkness of the narrow cavity. The shape resolved slowly, curved bone, the outline of fingers still curled around something small. His breath caught. "There's someone in here," he whispered. One of his workers, startled, dropped his crowbar with a clang. For a moment, no one moved. Then Miguel pulled back and reached for his phone. "We're stopping work," he said. "Call the police." Detective Laura King arrived less than an hour later, now a lieutenant, gray threading her hair. The scene was already sealed off with yellow tape. The medical examiner's van was parked near the loading dock, floodlights set up around the hole. Miguel met her at the entrance, pale and shaken. "It was right behind the old counter," he said. "The plans showed solid wall, but there's a 4-by-6-foot cavity. We didn't know." Laura ducked under the tape and stepped inside. The opening gaped like a wound in the plaster. Behind it lay a narrow space, barely large enough for a crouched person. Inside, the skeletal remains sat pressed against the far wall, knees drawn to the chest. The air carried a faint mineral scent, old concrete and dust. One arm was bent across the lap. In the right hand, something white and crumpled. The coroner, Dr. Patricia Holt, lifted it carefully with forceps. It was paper brittle and yellowed but legible under the dust. Evermart, 472, June 12, 1993, birthday candles, 289. Laura's breath tightened. She didn't need confirmation, but protocol demanded it. Within hours, forensic testing identified the remains as Elena Crawford, missing 11 years. Dental records matched perfectly. Time of death, approximately June 1993. Cause of death, undetermined. Dr. Holt examined the bones under portable light. No bullet holes, no knife marks, she said quietly. But there's microabrasion on the cervical vertebrae. Fine scratches, consistent with blunt trauma or compression. Also traces of cement dust embedded in the bone. She looked up at Laura. Whatever killed her, it happened while this wall was being sealed. Laura stepped back, staring at the cavity. The inner surface of the bricks looked new compared to the outer wall, smooth, as though laid by a practiced hand. She asked the forensic technician to check construction materials. The cement mix used in the patch was manufactured in 1993 and matched the same type used by Evermart for minor repairs that summer. Only someone with access to maintenance supplies and knowledge of the building layout could have created it unnoticed. That night, Laura reopened the case officially. The old file box was pulled from storage and placed on her desk. Dust rose as she lifted the lid. Inside, the VHS tape from 1993 still had a label in faded ink. Evermart Cameras, June 12th. She remembered the man who had operated that system, the same one who had guided her through the back hallway all those years ago. Frank Delaney. At the time, he had been cooperative, even helpful. She recalled how his eyes had lingered when she mentioned the missing woman's children. He'd since retired, last known to be living somewhere in Idaho. By midnight, Laura had written 2 pages of notes. Wall sealed during 1993 renovation, no record of authorization. Manager at time, F. Delaney. Verify construction orders, staff schedules. She turned off the lamp and sat for a long moment in the dark office. Outside, rain struck the windows in quick, steady lines. 11 years ago, she had stood on this same street, pressing her hand against the other side of that wall, certain something was wrong. Now the proof had come, piece by piece, rising out of plaster and bone. The following morning, she issued a formal request for all Evermart personnel files from 1993 and a background check on Frank Delaney. The wheels of justice, long rusted, began to turn again, and in Forest Ridge, word spread quickly. They had found the librarian. She had never left the store. She had been there all along, sealed 3 feet behind the wall that hundreds of people had walked past every week, chasing bargains beneath fluorescent light. What the town didn't yet know was that the real story, the how and why, was still buried deeper, hidden not in concrete, but in the careful lies of one man who had built that wall with his own hands. By 2021, the Parker case had lived longer than some of the officers investigating it. Files were scanned, duplicated, passed from one desk to another as younger detectives tried to make sense of the evidence that survived 2 decades. Each time the folder reopened, the same details stared back like a riddle written in a language no one remembered how to read. Detective Sarah Nguyen took over after Agent Hill's transfer to the Federal Division. She was in her 30s, methodical, and known for treating cold cases like archaeological digs, layer by layer, document by document. When she first met the Parkers, she apologized for not being able to promise answers. "Sometimes all we can do," she said, "is remove what isn't true until what's left might be." Her voice carried the fatigue of someone who had seen more ghosts than victories. Nguyen began by reviewing the timeline minute by minute. She mapped every witness statement and overlaid them on the original street grid. The patterns revealed gaps that the earlier investigation had overlooked. There were 2 security cameras within 1 block of Danny's diner in 2000. One outside a hardware store and another above a cash exchange office. The footage had never been preserved. The businesses had recorded over it within days. But Nguyen found a maintenance record showing that a private security firm had serviced the hardware camera that same week. She tracked down the technician, now retired and living in Arizona. He didn't have the tapes, but he remembered something odd. The camera had been tampered with, its lens turned toward the wall instead of the street. The discovery reignited debate among the team. Had someone deliberately hidden the abduction? If so, it implied premeditation rather than impulse, yet nothing in the Parkers' history suggested enemies or debts. The diner had no surveillance, no cash thefts, no threats. The case's simplicity, broad daylight, no witnesses, no ransom, was its most confounding feature. Nguyen contacted federal analysts who specialized in pattern recognition across unsolved cases. They fed the partial DNA profile from the alley into a national comparison algorithm. It returned 3 weak correlations. 1 to the unidentified sample from the Hartwell assault, 1 to a burglary in Idaho in 1999, and 1 to an unclassified entry labeled Unknown Male, Coastal Incident, 2002. Each shared several genetic markers, but none definitive enough to prosecute. The conclusion was both hopeful and frustrating. "Whoever he was," Nguyen said, "he moved." Laura followed the updates quietly. After 20 years, her understanding of justice had changed shape. She no longer wanted punishment, only clarity. At times, she asked the detective not to call unless there was something certain. "Maybe," she said, "is another funeral." Daniel, by contrast, became the keeper of the case's physical memory. He kept a binder of all public reports and taped new clippings next to the old ones, as if arranging evidence could summon reason from chaos. When Nguyen visited the diner, he would point to the timeline pinned to the back wall. July 27th, 6:55 p.m., the call from the factory. 7:10 p.m., Laura's arrival. 7:15 p.m., police notified. The 15-minute void. He still called it that. "Whatever happened," he told her, "it fit inside those minutes." Theories multiplied. Some investigators believed the abductor was a passerby, someone who saw the boy unattended and acted without plan. Others thought the man might have watched the diner for days, learning the family's rhythm. Nguyen proposed a hybrid theory. A transient worker, familiar with the area, who recognized opportunity and vanished along the highway. She cited similar cases from neighboring states: quick extractions, no follow-up, no ransom. The pattern was chilling in its precision. In March of 2022, a new forensic technology emerged: familial DNA matching through open-source genealogy. With the Parkers' consent, the state uploaded the unknown male profile to a database used for tracing ancestry. Months later, it produced a single possible link: a distant cousin to someone in eastern Washington. The man was interviewed, cooperative, and eventually cleared. But the result proved the sample was genuine, not contamination. The stranger had existed. That summer, Nguyen convened a review panel with forensic psychologists. They studied the file, noting how the suspect's behavior, quick abduction, no contact, possible relocation, fit the psychological profile of a compulsive opportunist rather than an organized predator. "He doesn't want recognition," one psychologist said. "He wants erasure. Taking a child unseen is his proof that he controls the world." For Laura, the analysis offered little comfort. "Profiles are words," she told Nguyen. "I need a face." In October 2022, a retired private investigator named Jim Keating contacted the Parkers after reading about the renewed tests. He claimed to have worked a similar disappearance near Coos Bay in 2001. a boy of 6, missing from a campground. The details were eerily familiar. No ransom, no sound, no evidence. The suspect sketch, drawn from a witness years later, showed a man wearing a dark cap. Keating provided his notes, and Nguyen cross-referenced them with the Parker file. The resemblance was striking but inconclusive. Without DNA or fingerprints, it was another whisper in a room already full of them. By the start of 2023, the department acknowledged the case would likely never reach court. Statute limitations for most associated crimes had expired, though murder and abduction remained open. Nguyen drafted her summary report, a document that read more like a eulogy than an indictment. Subject Owen Parker presumed deceased or untraceable, cause unknown, probability of homicide moderate to high, primary suspect unidentified male, itinerant status. When she handed the report to Laura, the woman read it line by line, then folded it carefully. "You've done your job," she said. "But I haven't." Daniel asked only one question: whether the evidence would stay accessible. Nguyen promised it would, digitized, preserved, impossible to erase. "That's what justice looks like sometimes," she said, "a file that refuses to close." Outside the precinct, rain began to fall, steady and unremarkable, the same kind of rain that had covered Salem on the night Owen disappeared. For the first time in years, Laura didn't rush to shelter. She stood there, letting it soak through her coat, as if the water could wash away everything unsaid. Justice had not arrived, not in the way stories demand it. But something quieter had taken its place. The knowledge that every fragment, the DNA, the letter, the memory, would outlive those who carried it. And perhaps that endurance, she thought, was its own kind of verdict. When the verdict came down, there was no applause, no visible relief, just the kind of silence that follows an unburdening too heavy for words. Frank Delaney was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, head lowered, his eyes fixed on the floor as if the tiles themselves might offer forgiveness. Outside, the reporters were waiting, microphones extended, camera lights flaring in the gray Oregon afternoon. Lieutenant Laura King stepped into that light briefly, said only, "The case is resolved," and kept walking. For her, this wasn't victory. It was closure shaped like grief. Frank's confession had been read aloud during the hearing. Each word was steady, deliberate, drained of self-preservation. "I was taking money from the safe. She saw me. I panicked. I didn't mean to kill her." The district attorney didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. The horror was in the simplicity. One moment of fear, a swing of a hand, a life ended, and then 11 years of silence, cemented over with a lie. When the judge pronounced the sentence, 25 years to life, he said, "This was not premeditated evil, but it was deliberate cowardice. You lived beside your crime as if proximity could erase it. It cannot." In the front row, Thomas Crawford bowed his head. He hadn't cried during the testimony, not when the coroner described how close Elena had been to the surface, how the wall between her and the world was less than 3 inches thick. But when Megan squeezed his hand at the verdict, the tears came anyway, quietly, as though they had been waiting behind his ribs all those years. Later that night, the Crawfords sat together at their kitchen table. The same table where Elena once wrote grocery lists and lesson plans. Megan placed a single candle in the center, lit it, and let the flame burn until it collapsed in on itself. "Mom would have hated all the attention," she said. Thomas nodded. Sam, now 17, said nothing. He had skipped school to sit through the trial, jaw tight, hands in his pockets. When the candle guttered, he said softly, "We were living next to her all that time. We shopped there for milk. She was right there." Detective King visited the house a few days later. The visit wasn't official. There were no papers to sign. She simply felt she owed them her presence after so long. Thomas met her at the door, thinner than she remembered, his hair gone gray. He poured coffee, neither of them drinking it. "I used to imagine her somewhere warm," he said, eyes on the mug. "A new name, a new life. It's easier to hope someone walked away than to believe they were trapped right where you stopped looking." Laura nodded, understanding more than she said. "You gave her back to us?" he added. She shook her head. "No, you never stopped waiting. I just found where she was waiting too." Frank Delaney's life in prison was brief in public record, but long in time. Inmates described him as quiet, reclusive, reading the Bible every morning, refusing interviews. He declined every request for appeal. In a letter to the prosecutor, he wrote, "Every time I close my eyes, I hear the sound of the wall closing. There's no cell smaller than that one." For the people of Forest Ridge, the Evermart became a point of pilgrimage for a while. People left flowers at the chain-link fence during the demolition. The press called it the Wall of Silence, and for months after, visitors drove from neighboring towns to stand near the rubble. Some came out of curiosity, some out of guilt for having once shopped there without knowing. When the land was finally cleared, only the foundation remained. Gray slabs under the rain, a faint outline of aisles where lives had once crossed. The developers proposed building a convenience plaza, but the town council objected. It didn't feel right, they said, to build over a grave, even one unofficial. Instead, the space was turned into a small community park, the Elena Crawford Memorial Garden. It was finished in June 2006, exactly 13 years after her disappearance. The dedication was simple. No podiums, no reporters, just a wooden bench under 2 young maple trees. A brass plaque read, "In memory of Elena Crawford, 1957-1993. A mother, teacher, and friend. Her light endures in those who remember." That summer evening, the Crawfords came together for the ceremony. Megan brought a stack of her mother's favorite library books, To Kill a Mockingbird, Little Women, and Charlotte's Web. She placed them in the small lending shelf by the bench, a quiet tribute. Sam laid down a small toolbox with a note inside. "For the woman who taught me to fix things, even when they break beyond repair." Thomas didn't speak. He just sat, staring at the plaque until the sun dropped behind the trees. When people began to leave, Megan stayed a moment longer. "She used to say," she told Laura, who stood beside her, "that no one ever really disappears. We just stop looking in the right places." Laura smiled faintly. "Maybe she was right," she said. After the ceremony, life didn't change dramatically. The Crawfords returned to quiet routines. Thomas retired from electrical work. Megan taught literature at the same high school where her mother once managed the library. Sam enrolled in a construction engineering program, designing safer walls, more transparent buildings, his small rebellion against secrecy itself. Each June 12th, they returned to the park. They brought a small vanilla cake with red frosting and 6 candles, the same kind Elena had gone out to buy. Megan always lit 1 extra candle for the year she missed. The flame wavered in the evening breeze, reflected in the brass plaque like a heartbeat. For Lieutenant King, retirement came a year later. She boxed her files neatly, but the Crawford case stayed on her desk until the last day. When asked by a local journalist which investigation she would remember most, she said, "The one that taught me patience, that truth can outlive the lies built to bury it." She paused, then added, "Sometimes the justice system feels like tearing down a wall. It's slow, it's noisy, and by the time you're done, you're covered in dust. But at least when the air clears, there's light where there used to be nothing." The story of Elena Crawford faded gradually from the headlines, but remained in local memory. Parents used it to warn their children about trust, about caution, about how ordinary moments can turn irrevocable. For others, it became a parable of endurance, the belief that even the most perfect concealment cannot last forever. And on quiet evenings, when the streetlights blinked on and the town settled into its usual rhythm, the park where Evermart once stood seemed to breathe. The trees whispered over the bench, and sometimes a passerby might think they heard the faint scratch of a pencil on paper. A woman writing a list, one word at the bottom written in smaller ink. Candles. The spring after the memorial garden was planted, Forest Ridge found its balance again. The story that had consumed its attention for months receded into memory, spoken of mostly by the older residents who still remembered the day the demolition crew found the wall. By 2007, the site had changed so much that new families driving past the corner of Redwood Avenue might never have guessed that a supermarket once stood there, or that for over a decade it had quietly hidden a body inside its concrete heart. But for those who lived through it, the space never became ordinary. Each year, on the anniversary of Elena Crawford's disappearance, a small crowd gathered by the bench. Some were friends who had worked with her at the high school. Some were strangers who'd read about the case years later and wanted to stand somewhere that had held both tragedy and resolution. They didn't make speeches anymore. They simply brought candles, simple white sticks, the kind you could buy anywhere, and lit them in silence until the dusk took their glow. Megan often arrived last, walking alone with a small bag of books. She was 30 by then, her face calm in a way that came from acceptance rather than forgetting. She would straighten the plaque, wipe away rain spots, and place a paperback on the bench. The titles changed. Sometimes it was a novel her students loved, sometimes one her mother had once recommended. When she taught To Kill a Mockingbird each spring, she always told her class, "Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like persistence." Sam rarely spoke in public about what had happened, but in college he designed his senior project around structural transparency. Buildings with inspection panels and accessible foundations, walls that could be opened for maintenance instead of sealed forever. When his professor asked why, he said quietly, "Because no space should be forgotten." His classmates didn't understand, but he didn't need them to. Thomas grew old in the same house on Maple Grove Street. He kept his wife's books in their original places, dusted weekly, and never remarried. Every morning he walked to the park, sat on the bench, and watched the traffic pass on Redwood Avenue. Sometimes he carried a paper cup of coffee for himself and placed another beside him, the way he used to when waiting for her after work. Lieutenant, now retired, Laura King visited occasionally, though she lived 2 counties away. She had written a short reflection for a law enforcement journal titled The Patience of Walls, describing the Crawford case not as a triumph, but as a reminder. "Crimes that vanish into routine are the hardest to solve," she wrote. "The longer silence lasts, the more it begins to sound like truth. Our duty is to keep listening until we hear what's underneath." Her former colleagues still quoted that line in training seminars. In 2013, on the 20th anniversary of Elena's disappearance, the town council held a small event at the park. The maple trees had grown tall by then, their roots breaking through the soil in slow persistence. The mayor spoke briefly, calling Elena's story a measure of how long hope can endure. When the speech ended, Megan placed a small vanilla cake on the bench, 6 candles, plus 1 for every year since, and lit them one by one. Sam stood beside her, taller now, the reflection of flame flickering in his glasses. "She always said wishes don't need to be big," he murmured. "Just honest." They let the candles burn down until the wax pooled, then left them there, melting quietly into the wood. Frank Delaney remained in prison. Time, The same slow force that had buried his secret worked now to erase him from public attention. He declined parole hearings twice. The warden later said he spent most days in the chapel, sitting near the back, staring at the concrete walls. When asked once by a prison chaplain if he sought forgiveness, he replied, "I already had 11 years of mercy. I just didn't use them right." By 2015, the bench's brass plaque had begun to dull. The town maintenance crew cleaned it once a year, but no one replaced it. Its surface held the marks of countless fingertips tracing the name, Elena Crawford, 1957-1993. In early summer, Megan noticed that the lettering had faded. She raised money quietly from her students and commissioned a new one. The replacement read the same, except for one addition at the bottom: "Found, remembered, and home." That autumn, Laura King visited one last time. The park was empty except for the hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves. She sat alone on the bench as the light faded. Her retirement had been peaceful, but every time she smelled wet cement or heard a hammer against drywall, the memory surfaced. She had learned over the years that justice never quite fills the shape of loss. It only outlines it more clearly. When she stood to leave, she looked back once at the bench, the candles, the trees. "You were never really gone," she said quietly, as if speaking to the air. The words hung there, carried off by the wind that moved through the maple branches. In the years that followed, the park remained a small but steady part of Forest Ridge life. A shortcut for children walking to school, a place for older couples to rest on their morning walks. Most who sat on the bench didn't know the full story anymore. They only knew it as the quietest place in town. And that, perhaps, was the truest ending. A peace earned not through forgetting, but through remembrance lived into normalcy. Every June, someone, no one ever saw who, still left a small bundle of birthday candles at the base of the bench, wrapped in brown paper. No note, no flowers, just the candles themselves. Sometimes there were 6, sometimes 7. The caretakers stopped removing them. They simply waited until rain softened the paper and wind carried it away. The town grew around its absence, yet the story of the woman who disappeared into a wall lingered as a warning and a promise that even the most ordinary walls can hold extraordinary secrets, and that truth, however long, buried, has a patience stronger than silence. If stories like this move you, where truth hides for years behind ordinary walls, remember to subscribe for more true crime investigations told with care and detail. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight?